7.4 hours a day looking at screens. And so we're processing a lot of information, a lot more information in a day than we did even just a few years ago. And so never has thinking been more important, and never has learning been more important to the rate of change. And so much of the thread throughout the book was really looking at how do we better understand thinking and optimize learning in today's world. I believe that learning will trump knowledge in the future. It's more important for us to be able to learn than necessarily have the knowledge in our heads, because we can so easily access it through technology. So there were several themes throughout the book that were about that notion of understanding information processing and what is it we need to be doing to better optimize our thinking. And all of us are experiencing that mental fatigue we have at the end of the day. So how do you protect your thinking time and make sure that you're taking advantage of your best thinking time to be as innovative as you possibly can? So lots of implications. And I know that one of the things that I did is I looked at the business book was when it was written in 1996 and talking to McGraw-Hill, we actually wanted to put cartoons in the book, and McGraw-Hill as a publisher was not comfortable with that. They said, no, this is a business book. We don't want any cartoons. And so one of the things we were able to do in this book, which is great because they were much more open to our ability to actually add some different visuals. Each cartoon, each chapter starts with a cartoon that kind of sums up that chapter. And so that was a pleasant surprise in terms of the openness of the publisher to our restructuring the book and adding something that might not have been in a traditional business book in 1996. So that was certainly a lot of fun.
Great, thank you, Anne.
Wonderful. I know I certainly felt that way myself looking through it, and so many amazing stories. But Anne, I want to ask you, what are some of your favorite stories from around the world that you gathered for the book?
Oh gosh, there were so many, and I think one of the hardest things for me in doing this was, you know, really kind of figuring out which ones we could use and which ones we wanted to keep, you know, from the past that were still very relevant. And there are lots, and those of you who actually have the book or will discover the book will be able to see that those stories can be very useful for you if you're as a practitioner looking for a great example of a story that that may be useful for you to illustrate a point you're trying to make. But one was a story from Brown-Forman, and this comes from our partners down under in Australia. And they had a challenge. They felt that they were pretty good at creative thinking, you know, and the marketing team was using all of the techniques that they'd always employed, but they realized that they were just coming up with good ideas, and they wanted killer ideas. They felt that in order to really promote Jack Daniels in the marketplace there, they needed to have some real breakthrough new concepts. So they brought in a whole brain approach to ideation and innovation, and suddenly found themselves coming up with ideas that went way beyond what it was that they had traditionally thought of, and were able to develop a concept around a Jack Daniels V8 supercar team, which became their #1 merchandising initiative, and they saw double-digit growth in that brand as a result. So it was kind of, they were sort of stuck in their tried and true creative thinking technique, which is kind of ironic when you think about creative thinking. And just by bringing in this notion of really kind of a whole brain approach, whole brain hackathon approach, they were able to significantly improve the quality of their ideas. And another example is from Caesars Entertainment, and Fred Keaton, who was an interesting leader there, was part of the finance department at the time, but also chief diversity officer, which is kind of an interesting occupational combination. And one of the things that he found, being in both of those functions, was that too often diversity was sort of just a program, and it wasn't really thought of as having a distinct business value. And so he decided that what they would put in place was a program around diversity of thought. And I'm actually seeing more and more of those programs pop up across the world, and really promote the value of cognitive diversity versus just sort of a traditional diversity as part of their HR program, and built a concept around what he called diverse by design teams. And the idea was, whenever you have a really tough challenge, one that warrants breadth of thinking, you put together by design a whole brain team, and then give them a process around which they can work to tackle that problem and make sure that they're looking at it from all perspectives. That notion of UID is a powerful one, and one that other organizations who we've worked with have seen as a best practice. So that's described in depth as part of that process, but in the book. But I would also just like to turn it to you, Yvonne, and ask you if you had a favorite story in the book, because obviously I had some, but I'm curious what might have been a favorite story for you.
There were so many of the stories that resonated with me in so many different ways. But as I thought about this, the one that I think I'd like to highlight is actually a story of conflict and misunderstanding between the CEO and the COO, who had literally been at each other's necks for 15 years. But after experiencing HBDI for the powerful, really intervention that it is, they were able to connect and to collaborate and to move things forward in their organization, both professionally and personally. The reason why I picked that is because so much of the work that I've done around HBDI has been powerful because it's changed the conversation and the paradigm between individuals, managers, direct reports, and teams to help them be more effective in understanding, appreciating, and harnessing the diversity of thought to change the environment and move things forward powerfully.
Great. That's a great example.
I love it. Dorota, how about you?
Yeah, for me, there are a number of stories that also resonate. Again, looking at the group of people I'm working with, technical leaders, the biggest one is always when people have this aha experience where it's kind of like, oh, so if I communicate that way, people may not get my point. And actually, there are different ways of communicating, and actually, there are different frames of the world and how people understand each other. So, for me, always those stories where there is this aha moment of, oh, now I get it. Now I know why communicating one way is just one way, and it may not get to various audiences or people who have a different preference. So, these were always my favorite ones.
Excellent.
That's great, Dorota.
And for anyone on the call, we'd love to hear from you as well. If you would insert your story, any favorite stories from the book, or your own personal experience using HBDI or whole brain thinking with your audiences and with your clients, we would love to hear from you as well.
And let me just say, I really love how you talked about the diversity of thought. I really think it's changing the conversation, the paradigm about how we look at diversity and how we build our teams and our organizations for the better, to really think better and to be smarter just across the board by recognizing that.
That's great, Yvonne. And I do think that there is definitely a trend in the marketplace toward the value of thought diversity, and we're hearing that language, and we're actually working on a white paper right now to address that, because it's at the end of the day, the output of thought diversity is where you're going to get the best thinking, especially for those tough challenges. And so it's an opportunity, a missed opportunity for many organizations, and I'm actually hearing leaders now actually use that terminology. So it's exciting, because I think it's something we've been talking about for a long time, but it seems to be moving into sort of the mainstream language, which is really quite exciting. I did see a question pop up about whether there was a question box or a chat box. I think most of the participants have a question box, so go ahead and use the question box. I just saw that pass through, so I just wanted to respond to that. Now, Dorota, I know you had a question for me.
Yeah, so how do you think we can incorporate the book into what we do? And it does assume that most of our are in the kind of a broader HR business, but I guess there are also people who are, you know, sitting on the other side of the fence, non-HR, and just wondering, okay, so if I pick it up, what is, in your opinion, as the author, the best way to apply that book and add value for our clients, for people we are working with?
That's really a great question, and it was a question I asked myself as we were writing the book, because it's a pretty comprehensive book. You know, it's over 400 pages, so it's got a lot of content in it. And I guess you could say it's professional deformation. So I of course always put things into a whole brain walk around as I think about them. And interestingly enough, and I've been talking to people who are actually using the book, and there are really two ways to look at this book. One is for you as a practitioner, as well as for, you know, those that you work with, your learners. And clearly, knowledge and data, it's an opportunity for you to just update your knowledge, refresh your knowledge. I had one person say to me, you know, I'd read this book, but it had been, gosh, you know, well over 10, 12 years ago, and I actually had forgotten some of the great stuff that's in here, and it's wonderful to have access to that, plus new data and knowledge. And so I was reminded of some things that I knew but had forgotten, and also I was able to learn in a way. And many people are using the book as a way to establish credibility for the work if they're introducing this to a new leader, if they're looking at sort of just talking about, you know, why is whole brain thinking important. For many people, that notion that there's a book available adds credibility, and it gives that person who you may be looking to influence an opportunity to do that personal deep dive. So that's clearly an A quadrant advantage. Another way you can consider using it is it's got lots of examples of specific activities in the book. Actually, by design, we put at the end of each chapter an opportunity for the reader to actually take this and make it their own. And so it's not just sort of that thing where you you know, you kind of get excited about looking at somebody else's story and content. And so it's really got some great examples of activities. And then, of course, there are descriptions of other activities in the content as well. So that's an opportunity for you or the reader or your learners to actually have them do that. And you can do that as part of your reinforcement of learning. I just got a great example yesterday from Susan Bixler at Bixler Consulting, who's been a partner and a practitioner with her team for quite some time, as well as a good friend. And it was fascinating. She said that they were, you know, Shelley Hamill, part of their group, was working with a group of people who had a wide range of experience, and was trying to help them see themselves as like a player coach, both as a leader and as a teacher. And so they went through their typical process of introducing the HBDI, play the diversity game, etc. But then they went to have them review chapter 11 of the Whole Brain Business book, which is about developing yourself and others and coaching and mentoring. And it really helped the learners better understand the concept of, you know, not only being as a leader that you needed to understand how your team members think, but when they became a coach, that they had to understand how their team members learned. So it was not only thinking and learning. And the participants comment that they could use to then work and apply this not only in their kind of leadership and coach roles, but also in terms of looking at conflict resolution. So you have an opportunity to use it as reinforcement and give learners an opportunity to dig in. And of course, it's available both in hardcover and as an ebook, so it's pretty easy for you to provide that kind of example. So thanks so much, Susan, for that great example. For you, it's a great reference book. And I had a practitioner say to me the other day that one of the ways that they're using it is they actually go to the index. And I never would have thought of this, so I thought this was kind of fascinating. And they go to the index, and you can look things up, for example, by the A quadrant. And you can look at all the A quadrant components, B quadrant, C quadrant, D quadrant. You can look up a specific topic that you might be interested in, like annual reports or entrepreneurial thinking. So you have the index as kind of an interesting quick reference for you, as well as the table of contents, of course, which kind of is a more global clustering. And then in the first chapter, it asks some critical questions about how to put your brain to work. And it's an activity that, and I think those questions can be very useful for you as you think about your work with your clients. And then, of course, personal application. And so I mentioned this earlier, every chapter's got an opportunity and activity that the reader can go through to put the book to work for them. And then lots and lots of stories. And so, you know, not only for you, if you're looking for a great story, you can reference that as part of your learning, or have your participants engage in that. And finally, just in terms of looking at how you position whole brain thinking, I had somebody say to me the other day, you know, we've been using this as part of our team development program, and I know there's a big opportunity for us to move this into our high potential program. So, wow, I now have a way to think about how I might position whole brain thinking differently and use the content as a way to think of that and get greater breadth of application in what it is that I'm doing. So those are some examples that I think you might find helpful as a way to think about how to really use this in a way that is truly added value. Anything, Yvonne or Dorota, that you would like to add that you found useful?
You know, it's so interesting. I have, over the 8+ years that I've been a practitioner now, I've found it useful in every way. Team alignment activities, helping break down silos, creative thinking and innovative thinking, problem solving. I've used it at every level, from, you know, staff all the way up through senior leadership and strategic planning. You know, I think I just carry a walk around pad with me everywhere because I have trained my mind to just start thinking about it. I think one of the most powerful things that you can do in terms of self-development is to use the think about with the questions to make sure that as I am, or I'll own it for myself, as I am thinking through strategies, plans, and ideas, that I've really covered it from a whole brain perspective. Because invariably when I don't, I'm missing something. And when I can look at it from every quadrant and think about it whole brain, I'm able to cover the full complexity of what the issue is and really come through with some breakthrough thinking.
That's great. Hey, I see that there's a comment in the question box where it looks like Bob is saying he was preparing to conduct a change management class and found chapter 19 in the book to be very insightful in addressing that particular audience, which is a great example. So if you're just looking at, gee, what is there out there that I can use as I'm thinking about a new application, it gives you kind of a baseline, and really looking at, you know, how I can apply that. And being a whole brainer and understanding that most people are not, I've learned to kind of pick my conversational approach better based on the audience, and the book gives you lots of examples of how to do that as well. So
and I love that. I love that about the change management chapter, that chapter 19. This is Betsy. One of the great things about this chapter and all the chapters in there is that it provides a lot of walk-arounds for you to contextualize your understanding of the topic at hand, like change management, but then see all the multiple perspectives from which other people are coming to it and why they might be more resistant to change. That's why I love all of the examples and models that are in the book.
That's great. That's great. Well, we appreciate all of that input. So I'm going to throw the question back to Yvonne and Dorota again. You know, clearly, I think one of the things that just writing this book did was it pushed my thinking in terms of how many ways you can apply whole brain thinking. I keep thinking we've discovered them all, and then going through the book and thinking about the breadth of application, I continue to be amazed by how many ways you can do that. And that was one of my big insights about whole brain thinking as I was writing the book, and especially in business, just the applicability is so broad. And so I'd like to ask Yvonne and Dorota and those listening in, what new insights did you discover about whole brain thinking from the book? Was there an aha that occurred for you in looking at the book that you kind of went, oh gosh, you know, I hadn't thought about that, or this is interesting, or I might use it in that way?
And this is Yvonne. I think for myself, as a couple of things came up, one of which I think I've alluded to, is that within the book, it really kind of encapsulated for me all the different tools and learnings and aha moments I've had for the past 8 years using the tool. It also, though, gave me some deeper insight into my own thinking and my own preferences, even though I've taken HBDI and I've, facilitated many things with it, that I was able to understand that, oh, so as I think about my own style, I am definitely more, and I'm multi-dominant for those of you who clearly don't know me, but I'm much more of a CD thinker, and sometimes I'm involved in teams and activities and working with people who are coming much more from an AB or an AD type of world. So for me, it helped me to really focus in on how I can frame my conversation and hone my thinking to be more effective as I'm navigating my own landscapes with my preferences.
Great. Dorota, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, again, in my space, I'm very much focused on technical people, and especially, kind of a first step is around communication. And I think I'm just looking at my notes. It was chapter 13 where you add there this kind of like questions or sentences around A, B, C, and D. And most of the technical people fit into A, which is just give me the facts. And then as we are discussing the model and we are opening it and we are telling them, so, B may ask what's the plan. And C will say, hey, show me that you care about me. While D will say, what are the possibilities here? What are you giving me as options? Where we can go with it? So it's interesting that as you kind of open it up in such a way, not only in a way that there are preferences, but you start to make it very real to people, and they start to respond to you that, oh, indeed, I heard that comment, or I sensed that comment, like show me that I care about you. Then they start to be more and more engaged, and I think that's something that I pick up from that book, because it helped me also in the learning programs kind of make the whole model much more relevant and sticky to the people we talk to. So that was the one that I'm using, and we talk about stories and we talked about other examples, but kind of like examples and those specific things where we can use, as I said, something that is sticking to our audience. This is awesome in this book. There is much more than it was in the book before.
Oh, that's great, Dorota. That chapter is focused on influencing, getting buy-in, and connecting with your customers, which is clearly an application that has grown in whole brain thinking pretty significantly. And as you speak about technical audience, another one of my favorite stories comes from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and we were talking about diversity earlier, the story goes that the presenters were using a very highly visual metaphoric model, and the technical audience, and these were all technical engineers in this advanced class, were just shutting down, right, because they were starting the program that way. And so they changed their opening slide to read the whole brain model of first-order engineering approximation to mental diversity. And suddenly the audience became fascinated with what it was that they were going to hear. And so that's one of the examples in the book. And I can admit that I would never come up with that definition of the whole brain model on my own. And suddenly, you know, the whole program felt quite different. So it's a great way of talking about how sticky you can make it by just positioning it correctly. So I love that, Dorota, and you have so much great experience with a technical audience. One of the things that was great for me as a learning as well was our opportunity, and an insight for me was looking at the CEO data, which of course we had looked at in '96, and we had significantly more data on CEOs, 9,300 CEOs. So the study is pretty comprehensive. We devoted an entire chapter to it in the book. And you know, looking at our at the time our 1.1 million data points across our current scientific database, and you know, having 9,300 CEOs, it's a pretty big deal. And what we learned was that you know, as we're thinking about developing the next generation of global leaders, we have some important things to consider. We have an opportunity, I think, to first better understand how we're defining leadership, what it is that we consider to be most important, and how we're going to, you know, really prepare leaders for the future. We saw differences across countries in terms of the most preferred quadrant. So there are sort of zones of preference and hotspots around the world in terms of some of the stronger preferences that we saw in looking at the CEO data. And as we consider, you know, some of the implications of that, the overall average for CEOs still is very close to a whole brain profile. And you'll note that there's a pretty strong tilt to the yellow, but a lot of balance as well. And that shifts ever so slightly from country to country. But knowing that the CEO in today's world represents a whole brain leader, and that's because the work requires it. What I believe is happening is that the need to be more of a whole brain thinker is actually moving lower and lower in the organization. And so it's not just left to the CEOs. And it doesn't require that you have a whole brain profile, because that still represents a pretty small percentage. 3% of our databases is really going to clearly be a 1-1-1-1 profile. But when we compared that to the average manager data and looking across the globe, we saw that, you know, there is definitely a gap, and as there's a lot of organizations today talking about the need to develop bench strength. We're trying to figure out how do we prepare leaders for the future, and there's some interesting opportunities, I think, in terms of looking at how we're going to be doing development and what that development might look like. And the book goes into more detail on that, but lots of data about leaders and CEOs, and it was really fascinating to do that deep dive and look at how do we develop thinking agility in those who are rising in leadership, irrespective of what their preferences are. How do we help them do that in a way that is intentional and deliberate, and provide them with thinking skills that allow them to be successful? So lots more to say there, but great chapter, and probably one of my favorites in terms of looking at some of my insights.
Wonderful.
Okay, so Anne, tell us a little bit, what are your key takeaways that each of us should take with us when we think about kind of next steps, when we are thinking about millennials, new generation, when we are thinking about, you know, what's the future? So what would be your advice? Where would you put our attention to?
Well, that's a big question. How much time do we have? There's certainly a lot. I tried to put as much as I could in the book around this, but there's definitely some general themes. One is that you know, every business runs on thinking in today's world. It's an opportunity for us to have a distinct competitive advantage. But we won't have that competitive advantage if we're not really looking at, understanding, and developing our thinkers across the world. And every participant that we work with, every learner that we work with is a thinker. And so we have an opportunity, first of all, to help them understand their thinking, which we often do with the HBDI, providing the thinker some practical feedback, sort of a snapshot of where their thinking is. But I think the next critical step is teaching them to be more deliberate in their thinking and giving them the tools and practice and skills so that they can really leverage their brain. Because today's world absolutely requires it, and most businesses really need this to have a competitive advantage. And, you know, wouldn't it be fabulous if companies were not just saying, well, yes, our greatest asset is our people, but not knowing what to do with it. Here, there's a clear answer to that question. How do you make your people your greatest asset? It's by understanding their thinking and helping them get the best possible results from that thinking that you can. And one of the models that's in the book that was part of our research in preparing for the book was to look at critical 21st century whole brain leadership competencies for future leaders. So we did a literature review, and I was really curious because I wasn't exactly sure what we would find. You know, was there going to be a bias towards that sort of more future-oriented kind of thinking that we hear a lot about when people are talking about the degree of ambiguity and speed of change and need to be strategic thinkers, etc. And what was fascinating for me in going through that literature review is that in fact it continues to be, and perhaps even more so than in the past, a whole brain challenge. And so as we're looking at the competency work that most organizations are doing today, it's important to have that diagnostic lens and sort of say, what are we asking our thinkers to do at each level? And how does that map against the 4 quadrants? And let's understand the gap analysis between where they are today and where they might be, where the role is, where their leader is. And I'm really excited. We're working on a new product called the Aligned Thinker that's going to help facilitate that process. But a first step is just understanding, what are you asking people to do? And the model can really help you get clearer on what you are asking them to do. And there may be additional competencies than those on this list. But I'm finding that many of the organizations we work with find this very helpful as kind of a way to sort of say, okay, are we paying attention to this? What do we consider to be most important? Are we missing a critical competency that perhaps our competitors might be focused on developing, or where is the greatest gap? And so this is a terrific tool, and I think the burden is on us because we as professionals in this space understand enough about how to do this development work that we can provide a huge advantage to our organizations and the thinkers in that organization in terms of preparing them for this new future and providing them with the tools that they need to do that. So those are just a few words about where we want to go in the future.
So, Anne, there's so much going on. Thank you for sharing that. What do you feel is missing in the left brain, right brain conversation?
I love that question, Yvonne. Yeah, well, you know, one of the things I address in the book, and this is one of the things that we've updated, is that when we look at left brain, right brain, right, we've seen this, many of us have seen this ad out there. This was a Mercedes ad. There are a bunch of different ads out there. One of the biggest things that's missing is this, and that is the notion of whole. And so part of what is critical, and it was fascinating for me to go back to the roots of the work as we updated the book, is that the premise, as initially really conceptualized by my father, was always whole. It was about whole brain thinking, and because of this sort of simplified ease of talking about left versus right, I think, fallen into a potential trap in terms of really oversimplifying the way the brain works. And so part of what the brain does in one of the early chapters is the brain does is part of its natural processes is it's highly interconnected by design. And so the book in one of its early chapters talks a lot about this notion of wholeness and how we need to move away. And I encourage those of you with us today to just drop the left-right language, because it leads to this notion of a dichotomy, which is just not a good representation, nor does it give people that core fundamental idea, which is an important philosophical basis of the work, which is that we are by design whole. We're created to be whole brain thinkers, but we've developed very strong preferences for some of our thinking preferences over others. But we all have access to our whole brains. And so there's a reason why this has always been called the whole brain thinking model. And I think it's really important for us to focus on whole versus the parts. And there's a whole lot of debate anyway, because we've always known that those different specialized areas of the brain which do exist do not function in isolation. They only exist through the interconnectedness with the other components of the brain. So this notion of wholeness is critical, and I think it's really important that we make sure our thinkers understand that they too have a whole brain, and what we can help them do is learn how to better access it. It also helps with, I think, people kind of getting thrown into categories, which is, of course, not what we want, sort of, oh, that's just a left brainer, that's just a right brainer. So really critical that we focus on whole, and I think it's the opportunity to give people, all of those thinkers out there, a message of hope in terms of who they are and what they can become as part of that. So that's what's missing for me, and I kind of, I'll get off my little podium right now and I clearly have an opinion on it, I guess. So I appreciate that question, Yvonne.
Thank you, Anne.
And so now we want to open up the floor for any other questions. Please add your question to that questions box that you have. And while we're waiting for more questions, there was a great one that came through during the webinar from Gary. It might put you on the spot a little bit, Anne, but if you were to recommend just 3 chapters in the book for maximum benefit, which ones would they be?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the question in 2 different ways, because I think it's a bit different if you're a practitioner versus just a thinker. Okay. And one comment on the book, and the book was really designed so that you pretty much, a thinker could read part 1, which is about the whole brain framework, and get what they need so that they could go directly to specific chapters in the other parts of the book and drill down without having to feel like they had to read all 400 pages. So that's an important design construct that you need to know. I would say that so from a practitioner perspective, I'll start with that. I would say that, I'm just looking here, I would say that chapter 10, Productivity Through Fit, individual job and assignment alignment, I'm seeing that is becoming more and more critical, and that's why we're working on the Aligned Thinker product suite, because we just don't have the luxury of not being clear, and I think that's a fantastic chapter. I think chapter 14, Whole Brain Leadership, The Secret to Thinking in Today's World. For those of us who are interested in leadership, really want to know more about that, gets you going in terms of providing that frame. If you're more interested in the CEO data, then it would be chapter 20 in the second spot. And then chapter 24, Stretching Your Thinking and Overcoming Mental Blind Spots, which is often a key application of the work, is a terrific chapter. but I would say that again, once you've kind of got the framework down in part one, you have an opportunity to cherry pick based on your specific interests and needs, and I think that's an advantage you have in the book. And if you read chapter 1, which is entitled "Every Business Runs on Thinking," in the Put It to Work section, there's actually an activity that is designed asking you questions that allows you to pick which chapters are best suited to answering those questions. So it was really designed to help you figure out, if you're interested in partnerships and beneficial relationships, then you want to go to chapter 13. If you're looking at competitive advantage through cognitive diversity, chapters 5 and 7, and so on and so forth. So definitely chapter 1, because that'll help you figure out which of the other 2 chapters you want to, that'll best fit your needs. And so I'm hoping that it gives you at least a beginning start.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe from Anne or Yvonne and Dorota. Any questions that bubbled up while you were talking more about the book? Anything that you wish you could have asked or wish you had been asked?
Wow. I think it's one of the things that I looked at was so interesting, I think I talked about it in question number 1, is how was it for you, Anne, really, to experience this work and have it to really grow up in it and to now be living it truly, right? And to now be living it out and seeing it impact the world so deeply and powerfully.
Well, that's a great question. So, and it's interesting because I was that was part of the focus of the TEDx talk that I just gave. So interestingly enough, and I actually tell this a little bit, this story in the book. I was, as many of you know, wired up by my father, to an EEG early in life, and that's kind of a strange way to grow up. You sort of, invite friends and neighbors over to get their brains explored after school, and actually that had an interesting impact on me. It made me very curious about learning, but it was a little much in terms of just sort of being so completely consumed by the brain and my father's very, very intense focus on it. And I really always thought it was interesting and was fascinated with the world of learning and kind of pursued my career. And it wasn't really until I kind of became involved in a workplace environment myself that I began to understand the implications. And what that reinforced for me, and this actually came through really loud and clear as I was working on this book, is, that my father really was not, he wasn't a psychometrician. He wasn't somebody who woke up one day and said, gee, I think I'm going to develop an assessment instrument looking at whole brain thinking or measuring thinking styles. He was a scientist trying to solve a workplace problem. And I think this is part of what differentiates this work than maybe some other models. He really was looking to see how can we improve what happens in the workplace. And he was doing the work in, at least at the time it was General Electric Corporation, to solve some very specific issues that related to, at the time, looking at creative thinking. Could it be taught? Learning, could we make learning more effective? Could we increase productivity in those that we work with, etc. And so that focus on a workplace application has a lot to do with why I believe the work evolved in the way that it did, and why it has such breadth of application in the workplace, because it was really conceptualized and designed with that in mind. And so a follow-on question I often get is, well, so what about your kids? Did you wire them up? So actually I did wire one of them up. I won't go into those details, but one of the things that has been really exciting for me is that we now have a third generation, so Ned's grandson and one of my 2 sons, Herrmann-Nehdi is our Director of Innovation, and so it's pretty thrilling to actually now have a whole new era of application emerge. And I think it's we're seeing a whole lot of things that you'll be hearing from Herrmann in coming months about some of where that will take us. So it's a very exciting time for me, because I think we've got a lot more to do, and we want to reach every thinker around the globe and help them really leverage their potential through whole brain thinking. So I feel like we've got a great team to do that now. But great question. Thanks, Yvonne.
Thank you, Anne.
And
we have one. Go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Okay. Just one thought that came to my mind when we are discussing this book, and you said that a little bit why you wrote the book, but do you remember a particular moment or a story or an event when it was this aha of like, I have to update the book. It is so much that you yourself experienced and learned, and there is so much going on, and there is so many messages that you thought, wow, you know, this is. So tell us about the trigger to write this new book.
Great question. I love that. So here, one of the things I've been, in recent years, I've been doing a lot more work with CEOs and senior leaders. And what became when I started to look at that data and doing the research on the CEO data to better understand those that I was working with, the demands of senior leaders, as well as those who report up into that senior leadership, I began to start swimming and digging in the data. And I, of course, thought, well, of course, we did that research back in '96, and I realized, oh my gosh, we've got so much to update here. So that was one of the critical triggers. And the other piece that kind of came along with that, so that's when the idea first sparked, like, boy, it's probably time for us to update this, was when I had actually a thinker say to me, where can I go? I want the latest and greatest application of this. And what resource can I get? I'd love to just, you know, suck all that information out of your brain, Anne, but I can't. Well, where can I go? And I thought, we need an updated resource for this thinker. And so it was a combination of my sort of research inclination with that question. And I thought, you know, we need something that's more updated, because there's so many new applications that go beyond what was originally described in the Whole Brain Business book. And we thought about writing a completely new book, but when, you know, we went down that track, there was enough really solid content that we felt still had great relevance with some updating, and then, of course, adding new content. So we did make the decision to go ahead and update this book rather than create an entirely new book. And so there was a thought process that was engaged there. That's a really fascinating question. I hadn't actually thought about it. That's Dorota, I love that.
I love the trigger.
There's a great comment here about entrepreneurship and chapter 25 on entrepreneurship. That's, you know, I'll say a quick story about that. When I was writing that chapter, as somebody who's been a lifetime entrepreneur myself, I had to ask myself some questions about the implications of my preferences on being an entrepreneur, and how my effectiveness as an entrepreneur was influenced by my preferences. So it got quite personal when I was working on that chapter, and we've got some really fascinating data about entrepreneurship, and I'm hearing more and more people, because there's such a surge of people starting their own businesses, working for themselves, whether it's a one-person shop or a five-person shop or a 100-person organization, and you know, what does it take? How do I do that? What kinds of implications might there be in terms of my preference? And then how do we develop intrapreneurs inside of our organizations, which is a concept that was developed many years ago by Gifford Pinchot, but that seems to be coming back, because I think we need that fresh thinking and what it is that we're doing. So great comments from folks who are writing in. Anything else you see on there, Betsy?
Yeah, I'm looking at for some other questions. It seems like people are agreeing with what you're saying, especially Savastumis, who submitted that plug for the entrepreneurship with HBDI. I think that's actually all the time we have available for questions at this point. Because we want to make sure that we are respectful of people's time. I'm just scrolling through again to see if there are any questions that we've missed. Some of the questions that have come through, we've made arrangements to just email after the webinar. There was a question about the Anne's TED Talk and when will it be available. We're still waiting on getting the recording. We will send it out in our monthly newsletter, so everyone stay tuned for that. Anne did a TEDx conference in Tryon about the brain, and we will post that when it's available. There are no other questions that I can see, so what I'll do now is thank Dorota and Yvonne for attending and for asking such great questions and being a panel for Anne to talk about the book and to share your stories as well. So thank you very much, you two. Now for more information about the book, including bonus chapters, how to buy it, visit our book website. That's wholebrainbusinessbook.com. We'll also put the Amazon link in the chat box for your convenience. And please contact us with any questions here at Herrmann International with phone, email, through the website or social media. Please get in touch. And so now we'll conclude the webinar. The webinar recording will be available on the practitioners area of our website. So that's hermannsolutions.com/practitioner. And also the handouts, everyone should have access to under the handout section of the GoToWebinar chat box. And so we can also send out a follow-up email just to remind people and give them those resources. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anne. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Dorota.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining in today.
Thank you.